From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump selects J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio, as his running mate, bypassing the likes of Marco Rubio, Doug Burgum, and Glenn Youngkin, among other potentially solid choices. Why did he pick the 39-year-old first-term senator? And how will that affect the campaign through November? Chances of winning for the Trump ticket? And more important, if they win for governing in the next 4 years of Trump's second term. Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot, here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with Potomac Watch, the daily podcast of the WSJ Opinion pages. And I'm here with my colleagues in Milwaukee, Kim Strassel. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Paul.
And Kyle Peterson.
Hi, Paul.
All right, let's talk first about the J.D. Vance selection, which is, of course, was sprung in typically Trumpian dramatic fashion on Monday. At least he got it in a couple of hours so he could write something, although we had sort of a suggestion that might happen, so we were prepared. But first, just set the framework here. J.D. Vance, in many ways, is an unusual choice because of what he had said in the past about Donald Trump. So let's listen to what he said about Trump in 2016.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him. And I've noticed this willingness from people who think a lot like I do that, look, we told you so. To all these white working class voters, we told you so. We told you that Trump was going to be a terrible candidate. We told you that you were an idiot if you voted for him. The problem is, if you take that attitude of sort of gloating over Trump's defeat, then you're playing into the very thing that gave rise to Trump in the first place. The media sort of asked me to be the spokesman for the white working class voter who's voting for Trump, right? But as somebody who doesn't like Trump myself, I understand where Trump's voters come from, but I also don't like Trump himself. And that's made me realize that maybe I'm not quite part of either world totally.
That was on Charlie Rose's show on public broadcasting way back in 2016. And he said he wasn't part of either world. Well, he's part of one world now. And he has moved substantially in those 8 years. And let's listen to him explain his change of heart regarding Donald Trump after he was selected on Monday.
I was certainly skeptical of Donald Trump in 2016, but President Trump was a great president, and he changed my mind. I think he changed the minds of a lot of Americans because, again, he delivered that peace and prosperity. If you go back to what I thought in 2016, another thing that was going on, Sean, is I bought into the media's lies and distortions. I bought into this idea that somehow he was going to be so different, a terrible threat to democracy. It was a joke. Joe Biden is the one who's trying to throw his political opposition in jail. Joe Biden is the one who's trying to undermine American law and order. President Trump did a really good job. And I actually think it's a good thing when you see somebody you were wrong about him, you ought to admit the mistake and admit that you were wrong.
Well, pretty deft switcheroo
Very.
There to explain how he changed his mind. And then I think Vance, you get a sense there. He's very articulate. He's very intelligent. He has a lot of intellectual dexterity. Kim, so let's talk about why you think Trump picked Vance and personal characteristics that appeal to Trump.
I think it's really interesting that initial clip you played, because you wouldn't think Donald Trump would go with this person. You know, we talk so much about his loyalty and how much he demands it. But this is another unusual characteristic of Donald Trump, is that you can offend him, but then if you turn around and you praise him and you make amends, he is willing to go a second round with you. And in this case, so much so that he chose a vice presidential candidate. This is all about the theme of this convention and this campaign, which is, this is the working man, the forgotten man convention. And in some ways, at least in the Senate, J.D. Vance has become a face of that. So Donald Trump is placing a lot of bets on not just bringing in all of those white working class voters, but expanding that. The Trump ticket would argue that doubling down on this is also why they have made some inroads in Hispanic working class voters, Black working class voters, why you're seeing those numbers shift away from Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. So this is about reaching out to all these people that Trump calls the forgotten man.
So he went to Yale Law School.
I know.
He worked as a venture capitalist.
Yep.
Okay.
And Donald Trump's a billionaire.
So I know J.D. Vance wrote Hillbilly Elegy about his difficult upbringing, and he escaped that. And that upward mobility attests to his drive, ambition. But is it his views, his bio? What is supposed to be the working man here?
So important to note, that book that he wrote, Hillbilly Elegy, was much more of a critique of cultural dysfunction. But the minute that J.D. Vance decided that he was interested in politics, he realized that there was political gold in embracing economic populism, and he's become that voice. And so when you listen to him, he's all in on tariffs these days. He can be very critical of companies that don't work in America. You know, he has proposed the possibility of new tax credits, for instance, for businesses that produce their stuff here in the United States. He's all about the union guy. He's been talking about union officials. The America First agenda has taken him down the road of saying, hey, we can't give any more money to Ukraine because we have to put our pensioners and Social Security recipients first. There's something, by the way, this goes far beyond Donald Trump's views on many economic issues, but there is something about the way he articulates them and what he's come to stand for that Donald Trump thinks will appeal to a group of voters he's courting.
He's a convert to those
Absolutely.
views,
He did not start that way.
and he has the passion of a convert in which he can be very dogmatic about those views for critics. He criticizes free market fundamentalism, he calls it, although it's hard. We haven't had a free market fundamentalism in the United States since the 1920s.
I wish, right?
Right. He's embraced Lena Khan, who is the Federal Trade Commission, whose leader, Elizabeth Warren's favorite regulator, who is, I think, breaking the law many times, as the courts have found, as she pursues antitrust policy.
He allies with Elizabeth Warren. He's, sponsored legislation with her.
Yeah, a lot. And you can do that with somebody from across the aisle if you think it's a useful purpose. But it's some of the legislation that is, it's more Warren legislation than it is typical Republican legislation. So, Kyle, that's all very interesting. Talk a little bit about what his assets. I mean, what can you expect him to bring to the ticket here, particularly the next 4 months?
I think the idea is that the Trump campaign is going to park J.D. Vance in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Michigan, these Rust Belt states. The Trump campaign occasionally talks about making a play for Minnesota. And the idea, again, is that he can speak to those workers and bring those workers who might have not voted Republican in the past, might be classic Union Democrats, maybe Reagan Democrats who have drifted away from the Republican Party back into the Republican Party hands. But I agree that the conversion is part of the most notable piece of his public record. And it does raise questions about what exactly the Trump White House policies would look like in a second term. And there's a contrast here with the old J.D. Vance when he was making a name for himself. And much of Hillbilly Elegy is about social dysfunction. So there's one section where he talks about working at a tile warehouse with a guy that he calls Bob, who was 19, had a pregnant girlfriend, and they were both, in his words, terrible workers. The girlfriend missed about every third day of work, never gave advance notice. Bob took these bathroom breaks, and people were chanting out the minutes, 35 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour. And here's the paragraph. He says, the problems that I saw at the tile warehouse run far deeper than macroeconomic trends and policy. Too many young men immune to hard work, good jobs impossible to fill for any length of time, and a young man with every reason to work, a wife-to-be to support, and a baby on the way, carelessly tossing aside a good job with excellent health insurance. And so a lot of that was not a story about big business, outsourcing jobs. It was about social dysfunction. And then J.D. Vance, as Kim says, decided he wanted to be in politics, and he needed the votes of guys in Ohio like Bob. And so now he is out visiting the United Auto Workers picket lines, proposing $7,500 tax credits for gas vehicles that are assembled in the United States. And maybe that is in part a pose, but it does raise questions, I think, about what economic policy in a second Trump term would really look like.
I want to get into more of that a little later. We talk about the governing implications, but we're going to take a break now. When we come back, we'll talk some more about the campaign implications of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with Potomac Watch Podcast, and I'm here with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. We're talking about the selection of J.D. Vance, a senator from Ohio, 39 years old, as Donald Trump's running mate. Now, my reporting suggests that Don Jr., Donald Trump's son, and Tucker Carlson were very instrumental in this selection. But Donald Trump, as he often is, was undecided until really the last weekend. There's some reporting now you read in the press that he had selected Vance several days earlier. Not true. He certainly was entertaining Vance, but I was told that they brought in Don Jr., brought in Tucker Carlson, brought in Elon Musk, brought in Silicon Valley to promise a whole slew of money to the campaign. And of course, after Vance was selected, Elon Musk said, I'm putting together something like 40 million each month, I think, for the campaign. So, Donald Trump likes that money, campaign money. So that was certainly influential in the Vance choice. And Vance, of course, had worked in those circles, but he had cultivated those money guys, particularly the non-interventionist types on foreign policy, which we want to get into. But I want to pursue this, Kim, this idea of what he brings to the campaign in terms of electoral advantages. Apart from the working class angle, parking in those Rust Belt states, he's from Ohio. That's going for Trump anyway.
Yep.
He's a white guy.
Right.
He doesn't speak experience, stability. He's a bit of an unknown to the American public. It's true. Hillbilly elegies flying off the shelves now.
It's a great way to sell books. Be a vice presidential candidate.
That's right. But I tend to be in the camp that says Donald Trump already had a lot of those working class voters with his persona, his people know him, his economic success in the first term. So I think Trump could have made what I would call a coalition broadening pick, could have put Virginia in play with Glenn Youngkin, perhaps. Even a Marco Rubio, who I'd have disagreements with, would have been somebody who would be able to speak to Hispanic Americans. He's fluent in Spanish and so on. In other words, this is a reinforcing pick for Trump. And it's a pick about maybe 2028 and his legacy more than it is about this November. It suggests to me that he's very, very confident about winning.
Absolutely. And I hate to be the party pooper at the Republican convention, but honestly, I think J.D. Vance gets Donald Trump little or nothing on this ticket, which is why I am completely surprised by this still. If you look at their right, white working class voters, I get that he wanted to magnify that. But if you dig into the polls this year compared to 2020, compared to 2016, he's already kicking it with white working class voters. I also don't necessarily buy that the peel off that you are seeing from Hispanic and minority voters, which is helpful to the campaign, is even entirely due to the working man pitch, in that what's driving a lot of voters to Donald Trump is memories of better times past compared to what is happening now. They associate with him. And it's not clear that having another person that looks just like him is going to magnify, as you say, that ticket whatsoever. Donald Trump is enough. What he's missing, the huge hole he has here, is suburban voters, moderate voters. And those are the people that have drifted away from the Republican Party and have caused the GOP real grief in recent elections. And if he'd have chosen a Burgum, if he'd have chosen a Nikki Haley, he really would have added to the ticket. This does not do it.
On that line, Kyle, you're seeing, and I'm hearing, an awful lot of concern among business community, free market conservatives, who are thinking, where does this Vance pick mean for the direction of the Republican Party on economic policy? Vance reinforces protectionism for tariffs. He reinforces support for big labor. And I'm not talking about workers here. I'm talking about the big labor agenda. He has come out against right to work legislation, which is the ability of individual workers in 27 or so states to be able to not join a union if they want. That's a liberty question. It's a worker rights question, and yet he sides with the unions on that. I could give other examples. Most of the business community has been lining up behind Donald Trump because Joe Biden has moved so far left on economics. Where does this leave business America?
It leaves them wondering what policy would look like. And in fairness to President Trump, Joe Biden is not exactly a business-friendly president either. He wants the PRO Act, for example, to impose union-friendly negotiating rules on businesses. And so maybe that is part of the thinking on President Trump's team, is that they are not going to drive those people into the arms of Joe Biden. But I do agree that it is a potential risk here, because think about Trump's first term and the economic success for business, for workers, rising wages that we saw, the 2017 tax cut. That groundwork was laid by a Republican Congress that had been advocating those ideas for a long time, including under Paul Ryan, and advisors that were brought into the White House, including by Vice President Mike Pence. And I think this does raise many questions about what the Republican Party stands for. Last night at the convention, you had the president of the Teamsters railing against business to these Republican delegates. And I think those questions are getting bigger with the addition of Vance to the team, and the idea that the person who is the last person who is going to be talking to President Trump about economic policy is no longer going to be Mike Pence, an old Reaganite hand. It's going to be J.D. Vance.